Hi, of course it's Colin Quinn, and you're listening to the podcast on the Pantheon Network.
Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 6, Episode 28 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. I can probably do those hand gestures with my eyes closed at this point, which for all those of you just listening, I'm sure you're thrilled about that. Thank you, as always, for listening and watching. Listeners, lovely people, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotgenre to see my face, see the video for every single episode of this podcast. Those of you just watching, nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre gives you links to everywhere that this podcast is featured, either the YouTube video or every single audio out there, wherever podcasts are streamed. Let's get right to this. Oh, yeah, and of course, the one thing, still fundraising for a Season 7. I'm enjoying Season 6 more than maybe any other season for so many reasons, partly because I get to work with my wife on all of these at her suggestion. She's an incredible photographer and is doing the video for me for this, and is just a great person to work with. Hire her. And also because the topics I've chosen, I think, are as diverse as any other year, but I've really kind of settled into a kind of a groove here, and I would like to continue that for Season 7. If you agree, please click one of the links below and support this podcast. I will not be able to do this podcast if I don't get some more support for it, either through patreon.com/musicisnotagenre or the fundraiser that I have, GoFundMe. Either one, please help out. Even a few dollars makes a difference. Let's get into the topic. And that is, if you tuned in last week, you know what I'm getting to. What's an album and why? Part 5.2, the 1990s album Supernova. Or I might have said the 90s album Supernova. I don't know. Check the graphic. Either one. It's about the second half of the 1990s. Why the subtitle? First of all, brilliant flash of creativity and sales and size and number of albums released, as I talked about before. And I'll talk about some of those other, things later. I've talked about the creativity, and I'll talk about that more. The size of the albums I'll talk about in conclusions here. And all of this grew and grew and eventually exploded as the industry exploded, as we know what happened in the late 90s and especially in the 2000s. Massive changes in the industry in the 2000s. And yes, it's also a reference to the Oasis song, Champagne Supernova. So that's the subtitle. The top decade for album sales ever was the 1990s. Peaked at the end of the decade, somewhere I want to say it was 99, actually, before it hit a pretty steep decline, and has never fully recovered from that. And largely because physical sales don't much exist anymore. It's also the decade in which some of the longest albums were made in physical form. And I'll give you a breakdown on album lengths and the conclusions. And I mean not double albums, because you make a double, triple album be as long as you want, even on other formats. You can, I have people who put out, quadruple albums or whatever on vinyl or cassette. CD allowed for more space, so album length grew because that's what artists do. And why not? Pack as much in as you can, right? And to recap, we left off 1994 last episode, which was the peak of grunge. And so we'll start with 1995 this episode. I'm going to do year by year as usual, including, as you know, notes for the year, top albums, notable debuts, and other notable releases. And then I'll give you some conclusions on the second half of the decade and the decade in general. The different featured song from last week, questions for you, and don't forget to check out the bonus MXtra video for this second half of the 90s episode, which is a stats video. The stats about the top 10 songs from the late 80s to the early 2000s, showing you how rock, which we think of the 90s as a big rock decade, and yes, it was. I mentioned that in the first episode of the 90s. was not as ever present as you think. And you will see this weird kind of reverse bell curve that happens with the top 10s if you tune in to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre for the bonus MXtra video for this episode. Sources, of course, Wikipedia, digitaldreamdoor.com, radio.co.uk, Paste Magazine, You Discover Music. And that U is a letter U, Discover Music, all one word. Look it up. It's a cool site. Usual disclaimers, I'm going to leave out a lot. I will be biased, especially with the debuts and notables, partly because I lived through it. I will do my best to include a little bit of everything as usual, because all music is important and music is not a genre, is what I've heard. Let's get to it. So 1995 was just another diverse and another disparate year. If you remember back 1994, all the way from last week, was the year when the most number one albums hit since 1974. In both cases, unless I'm counting wrong, 23 albums reached number one in that calendar year in 1974 and in 1994. And that number would not be surpassed until the internet age. So for physical sales, those 2 years are the biggest for albums hitting number one in a given year. You see in 95 how grunge was still present, but already starting to fracture. Already. What a quick flash. Although grunge, if you remember the King's X episode and others I've done, had been around in some form since before it had a name, at least maybe even as early as the early 80s. But as a phenomenon, of course, it was basically like a 4-year thing, you could say. Those cracks in the grunge world let in even more diverse rock and music in general, such as the further defining, like all of music was getting more diverse, the further defining of what 90s R&B would sound like, which became the classic sound, one of the classic sounds of R&B, more so even than the earliest part of the 90s. It was a bit of a quiet year for debuts, but sneaky, and also more debuts than in any previous year. This was a huge freaking year. This is when I talked about last episode how the number of albums released stayed around 20,000, a little bit above or below, plus or minus, from the mid-60s through the mid-80s. And sometime between 85 and 95, then it's because of the CD, really, things started to grow to the point where that doubled. The number of albums released in a year pretty much doubled by 95 and would get even bigger after that. So this is a pretty big year. Lots of hits, lots of hit albums went to number one. I said 20 wasn't 23. That was 94, but quite a damn few hits albums. So when I read my notes, I don't always highlight the word that I should highlight. So let me give you a second reading. It's take two. Take two. Mark, lots of hits albums went to number one. So albums like compilations of hits, including Garth Brooks' hits, which topped them all. Springsteen's hits, Michael Jackson's History, Book One, some hits. And not quite hits, but kind of close, is the Beatles Anthology one. Those three anthology collections were huge for me, still are. But that was the first one in 95. And that was kind of the beginning of a Beatles comeback, if you could call it that would not let up ever and hasn't. Some soundtracks, which have been ever present in this decade, a bunch of them hit number one, including or all of these, the Lion King soundtrack, the Friday soundtrack, Pocahontas soundtrack, and the Dangerous Minds soundtrack. So pretty diverse music, really. Or I guess two Disney and two kind of hip-hoppy things. Van Halen was still going strong, had a number one album. Same with Pink Floyd, this resurgence of Pink Floyd. Mariah Carey had a number one. Selena's debut album went to number one. Alanis's Jagged Little Pill. And please remember this album for the following year, 96. But it went to number one in 95. Boyz II Men 2, again, was number one in this year. Alice in Chains, Tupac had a number one album. Bone Thugs and Harmony, The Dog Pound, which was, I think, Snoop's colleagues, or was a band. R. Kelly had a #1 album. And yes, Alice in Chains, Smashing Pumpkins' Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. But the top album for the year, if there was any way to spell the death of grunge in 95, and many of us thought of this, was Hootie and the Blowfish's Cracked Rear View. Keep that in mind as well. Debuts: Wilco, Sunvolt, Ben Folds 5, The Presidents of the United States of America. So a lot of post-grunge there in many different ways. Hanson, Guster, Maroon 5 as the band Kara's Flowers. Their original name, they released an album under that name in 95. Sugar Ray, I Just Want to Fly, I believe. Apples in Stereo, and Elf Power, the first albums from the Elephant Six Collective. One of my favorites. I did an episode on them. Huffamoose. I have a small connection to Huffamoose in that the guy who produced my album in the early 2000s is also from the Philly area or worked in Philly with a guy named Shelly Yakis. And Huffamoose was, I think, a Philly area band. And I mentioned them as the people I wanted to model my album after. And he said no. Which, long may he rest in peace, because it was a pretty tragic ending for him. But I wish that I had understood better the relationship between producer and artist at the time, and understood that my instinct will always lead to a better place than someone who doesn't understand the music I'm doing. A lot of great songs were on that album, the Metro Grand Sessions. You could look it up. But it's one of 2 albums in my catalog that I feel could have been just better based on the fact that I didn't assert myself enough in creating the sound that I wanted. That's a nice tangent. Some more debuts of 1995. Deftones, Silverchair, You Wait Till Tomorrow, Supergrass, Brian Jonestown Massacre. Another example of post-grunge types of rock, like all those. Some with post-grunge that had a grunge tinge like Silverchair, and some like Supergrass or Brian Jonestown, not at all. Incubus, Filter, AFI, Blink-182, Local H, Foo Fighters debut in 95. I mean, think of all of the rock that happened there that really was not about grunge at all. I mean, Foo Fighters, of course, came out of grunge, but then they made it their own in so many different ways, even from the beginning. But AFI was post-punk, and Blink-182 was like eventually became like the third wave emo or whatever you want to call that. And Local H was sort of somewhere in between the two. Just amazing. Chemical Brothers' debut album. They've been working for years. Their first album was in 95. Tricky, Trip Hop debut. Goody Mob, Raekwon from Wu-Tang, Juvenile, Montel Jordan of the This Is How We Do It fame, D'Angelo, not my favorite album of his. That would be Voodoo. I think this was Brown Sugar. Christian McBride, an amazing jazz bassist, I want to say from Philly. I don't know. He worked with the Roots. Those 2 people, D'Angelo and Christian McBride, would be big in the upcoming neo-soul movement, or it started before, but it really would surge in the late 90s, and you'll see more of the neo-soul as we go on with this. Enrique Iglesias, debut album in 1995, Garbage, Shirley Manson, Sleater Kinney, Robin with a Y, Elastica, Cat Power, Jewel, Joan Osborne, Natalie Merchant, Faith Evans. I mean, that's some diverse women just rocking debuts in 95. Squirrel Nut Zippers. So a kind of a variation on the swing revival, and probably my favorite of those swing revival bands, because they were more like 20s music, honestly, than 40s. Jars of Clay. Interesting that the more the 90s went on, the more you see crossover Christian rock acts like Jars of Clay. Quite a few debuts and some minor hits and some bigger hits like Jars of Clay happened in the 90s from Christian rock. And we talked a little bit about Christian rock in the King's X episode with bands like Stryper and all that, and King's X themselves, so to speak. But it really was, I think, in terms of rock, not in terms of other kinds of music, but Christian rock was just beginning to hit like its biggest successes there in the 90s. Kenny Wayne Shepherd, Opeth, Swedish prog metal, Less Than Jake, ska punk. So a lot of interesting debuts. Some other notable albums of 95. PJ Harvey, To Bring You My Love. Matthew Sweet's 100% Fun, which is my favorite album of his. Please look it up. Radiohead's The Bends. Come on. I think probably my favorite album of theirs, although that's hard with them because they change so much. Bjork's Post, The Verve, A Northern Soul, which I'm pretty sure that's the one that had Bittersweet Symphony. Blur, The Great Escape, Pulp, Different Class, Oasis, What's the Story, Morning Glory, No Doubts, Tragic Kingdom, Faith No More, King for a Day, Fool for a Lifetime. 3-6 Mafia had one. The Far Side had one. Coolio's Gangsta's Paradise. LL Cool J's Mr. Smith. Prince's The Gold Experience. Springsteen's The Ghost of Tom Joad, which is a classic now, and Elliott Smith's eponymous album all came out in 95. If I said 96 before, it's because I'm crazy. But those are all 95 notable albums, which does bring us to 1996. It is the second to last year ever in history so far that any rock album was top number one album of the year. Not only number one of the whole year, but number one at all in a given year, depending on how you classify rock. I would say it was the last time any hard rock album went to number one ever, almost 30 years ago. It just shows shifting demographics, greater diversity, and that, you know, as you will see in the bonus episode when I talk about number ones, top 10 songs from 88 to 2002, I want to say is what I did. You'll see how few of those were rock. Stay tuned for the next installment of What's an Album and Why on the 2000s, whenever that's coming, and you will see how rock was actually in many ways bigger in that decade than it was in the 90s, at least in terms of sales charts and things like that. Lots of shifting in general, though, in 96 is seen by yet another packed list of number ones that may be the best mix of new, mid-period, and old artists on the number one charts for number one albums that I have seen so far. Also a ton of iconic hip-hop. And we see electronic music start to take a little bit more of a hold. You know, it had been around for a long time, but this is when it really started to surge. It was a so-so debut year, I will say that. Lots of underground metal of all subgenres, as well as, again, as I mentioned, a lot of Christian rock. Top albums of the year. Ever-present Mariah Carey, Celine Dion. Another Hootie album made it to number one. The Beatles anthologies 2 and 3 made it to number one. So all three anthologies eventually made it to number one. Van Halen's Best Of made it to number one. Volume 1 made it to number one. The soundtrack to Waiting to Exhale. So you already have a ton of variety in these lists of number one albums. Tupac's All Eyes on Me. And had a number one album, Tupac, under the name Machiavelli. Fuji's The Score. That's their huge one. Nas and A Tribe Called Quest, The Dogfather by Snoop, all number one albums. New Edition had a comeback album featuring all 6 members of the band for the first time together. And that was a number one album one of the number one albums of the year. Nirvana's From the Muddy Banks of the Wish Call. Pearl Jam's No Code. So still some grunge happening in 96 and number ones. Bush had a number one album. Counting Crows' second album. Rage Against the Machine. Metallica's Load, which, by the way, is on one of these. You know, if you didn't tune in last week, especially those of you listening, behind me are only some of my CDs. And the reason I turned the speakers around so you could see the shelves this time is because most of these are 90s albums. No Doubt's Tragic Kingdom, again, number one. But the top of the year, as I mentioned, for you to remember this, Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill was freaking huge in 1996. And boy, has she had a resurgence in the last few years. Some debuts of 96. I said it was a so-so year for debuts. I don't think that's true. I think I prejudged, and then I kept that note for your listening pleasure. Some debuts, these are actually pretty big. Spice Girls, Backstreet Boys, Drew Hill, Genuine, Maxwell, Fiona Apple, Duncan Sheik, Jillian Welch, Leanne Rhymes, Busta Rhymes, so that's 2 rhymes for those of you counting at home, Lil' Kim, Foxy Brown, Eminem's debut was a small release, but it happened, Jay-Z, Ghostface Killah, Dr. Octagon, DJ Shadow. These are some amazing debuts, honestly. Sneaker Pimps, Fatboy Slim, one of my favorites, at least at the time. Morchiba, Thievery Corp. This is what I was saying. Electronica was showing up. A lot of debuts from Electronica, a lot of notable debuts from Electronica. Matchbox 20 and Nickelback. This is true. You know, when you have Hootie's second album hitting the charts, and then you have Matchbox 20 and Nickelback debuting, you know that grunge was on life support. Stained, At the Drive-In, would be eventually, that would morph into Mars Volta. Nada Surf, Super Furry Animals, Chibomato, Spoon, Modest Mouse, Bell and Sebastian, Kula Shaker, Imperial Teen, Olivia Tremor Control, and Neutral Milk Hotel, 2 huge Elephant Six bands debuted in 96. Fountains of Wayne's debut. Fountains of Wayne. One of my first episodes, or at least in the first 20, I want to say, or whatever, first season, was on, my first Death is Dumb was on Adam Schlesinger. The singer, not singer, I'm sorry, that was Chris Collingwood. The songwriter for Fountains of Wayne and so many other things, and one of the members of the band, of course, Revere. And this band I'm in now, Joy Buzzer, playing bass, models themselves very much after Fountains of Wayne. A lot of their music sounds like Fountains of Wayne, frankly, or bands like that power pop, a really great, you know, second, third wave power pop, whatever you want to call it. Their debut album was 96. It made such an impact on me that it eventually changed my music. And I feel as though I should do a fuller, deeper dive on Fountains of Wayne in the future, since I talk about power pop all the time, and they're pretty much right at the top for me. And that. Another debut, as far as official, which is me under the artist name Nick, all caps, Your EP. So not an album, but I had to put it in there. That was when it came out in 96, and it has some classic songs. Look it up. Or look up 96-95 under the Rec moniker, Rec, R-E-C, and you'll see a lot of stuff there. Some other notable releases in 1996, Beck's Odelay. I always forget it was 96. I always think it was later in the 90s. But man, talk about an album that made an impact on not just me. Weezer's Pinkerton, that one where everyone's like, what? And now they're all like, yeah. STP's Stone Temple Pilots, Tiny Music, Casino Vatican Gift Shop, which was, I think, their peak. Soundgarden's Down on the Upside, Social Distortion, Tool's second album, Marilyn Manson, Antichrist Superstar, Sublime's eponymous album, Sleater Kinney Call the Doctor, Beth Orton, Trailer Park. Beth Orton just released something recently where I was like, yeah, she's killing it. Tori Amos's Boys for Pele. The Cardigans' first band on the moon, which is the Love Fool, is love me, say that you love me. More great Tony Braxton, so another notable album from Tony Braxton. Blackstreet, on which No Diggity. The Roots, Illadelph, Half-Life, they just keep pumping out amazing albums. I mean, they've always done that, but they had a run from like the kind of early mid-90s through mid-late 2000s that was just absolutely fabulous. Tricky, Pre-Millennium Tension, somewhere on these shelves. Outcast, Atlians, I think it's pronounced that way. Stereolab, Emperor Tomato Ketchup, and Orbital Insides. Which brings us to 97, the first fully post-grunge year. You had, whispers of grunge kind of echoing, reverberating in 96 and 95. This is really... The decade was getting tired of itself, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the conclusion to this episode about the kind of idea of the decade getting tired of itself. Typical 90s ennui. Any band doing anything sounding like grunge at this point was an echo of what came before. A lot of people call it grunge light or pop grunge, whatever. But other kinds of alt rock was thriving, like nu metal, which was rap rock. Many other kinds of metal, alt or, indie rock in general was thriving. A lot of pop punk debuts bubbling under, ready to take over eventually, especially in the 2000s. This year was not the 2000s, but it was like a crystal ball for the 2000s, showing what would be coming. Pop and electro and R&B and hip hop were getting ready to rule everything, notwithstanding all the rock I just mentioned. And showing that division was coming too, that this idea of everybody listening together in many ways to a lot of the same things was slowly coming to an end. As evidenced by, up to that point, the most number one albums in a year. So, hey, guess what? That thing I said about 1994, I overstated. Yes, there were 23 number one albums in 1994, as there were in 1974, but that was just put to shame by 1997. This year, 29 albums made it to number one. That's going to take a while to get through, people. Hope you've got time. Debuts were disparate, but had a lot of notable artists. So let's get into some of the albums of 97. The only rock album to make it to number one in 1997 was Aerosmith and U2's Pop and Live's album and Metallica's Reload, Fleetwood Mac. Oh, and the Howard Stern Private Parts soundtrack. So those were the number one rock. Now, okay, so I just mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then tangentially to rock, No Doubt, and The Prodigy. So maybe 8, depending how you count. And you say, oh, that's a lot. But out of 29, that's not a ton. Garth Brooks and LeAnn Rimes and George Strait all had number one albums. Country was continuing to dominate. Bob Carlyle's Christian rock, or Christian singing, I don't think he was rock, number one album. I don't know what song made that number one. If you know Bob Carlyle, tell me. Lots of hip-hop made it to number one. The Gridlocked soundtrack, the Men in Black soundtrack, Scarface, who put out an album in the 2000s that I still love, a song On My Block. I freaking love it. Biggie, Wu-Tang, Puffy, Bone Thugs and Harmony, Master P, Nas's group The Firm, Mace. All of them went to number one. Huge year for hip-hop. Boyz II Men, Holding On. Mary J. Blige, again. Mariah Carey, again. Janet Jackson, again. Barbra Streisand, again. But the year's winner, 97, was Spice Girls. Spice Girls album number one for the year 97. Debuts, 98 Degrees, Aaron Carter. So, pop, you know. Lil Jon with the Crew. Missy Elliott, Erykah Badu. So, wait a minute. Missy Elliott and Erykah Badu. Just stop there, right? Amazing. Debuts in 97. Daft Punk, Robbie Williams. So Daft Punk. Natalie Imbruglia, Nico Case of Montreal, which is an Elephant Six band. The Hives, who I am getting to see this year for the first time when they open for the Foo Fighters in July. That's a Swedish band. I did a whole episode on the Hives. Look it up. Him, H-I-M, all caps. Lit, Godsmack, Godspeed You Black Emperor, Sigur Rós, the Icelandic ambient, crazy, amazing band. Papa Roach, so Sigur Rós, Papa Roach, Switchfoot, Smash Mouth, Seven Dust, Yellow Card, the Ataris, Third Eye Blind, one of my favorites from the decade, Five for Fighting, Marcy Playground, I think that was Sex and Candy band, Marcy Playground, Days of the News, Save Ferris, Limp Bizkit, so new metal, Creed, Travis, Derek Trucks, Leanne Womack. So some more country artists, but more on the, in a way, in an alt side. Other notable debuts, Corner Shops When I Was Born for the Seventh Time, which has Brimful of Asha and, so many other amazing songs. Super Furry Animals, Radiator. Supergrass, In It for the Money. Sarah McLachlan, Surfacing. Blink-182, Dude Ranch. Beth Orton, Trailer Park. Blur, which had the Song 2. The Verbs, Urban Hymns. That's the Verbs album that had Bittersweet Symphony. I know it because I have it. Usher, My Way. Ben Folds 5, Whatever and Ever, Amen. Huge for them. McCartney's Flaming Pie. Sleater Kinney's Dig Me Out. Spice World. Foo Fighters, The Color and the Shape. Chemical Brothers, Dig Your Own Hole. Bob Dylan's Time Out of Mind, kind of the beginning of a comeback for Bob Dylan. Deftones and Portishead had great albums. Shania Twain's Come On Over. Elliott Smith's Either Or. Bjork's Homogenic. And, of course, Radiohead's OK Computer. 97 was, again, really weird mix, disparate freaking year for music. 29 number ones, but amazing. And I think this is a good time to stop for the mid-roll. We will be back after my usual message. Hey, so I was going to do the usual and just list all of the links that I'd love for you to check out, but I realized that everything you need to know and everywhere you need to go is at nickdimattio.com. That really is the hub. I list all the links in every episode just in case, but nickdimattio.com is where I put everything that I do. If you want to know more about this podcast, whether it's the audio version or the YouTube version at youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre or wherever else the podcast shows up, or if you want to support the podcast at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, just go to nickdimattio.com. It's all there. If you want to check out my full discography of original music and covers, for my band REC, R-E-C, and Beyond. It's at nickdimatteo.com, including all the streaming and social links for wherever you listen to music and wherever you check out your soch. My acting clips are there. My voiceover clips are there. Graphic design, my blog, and most especially, it's the best place to contact me. If you go to nickdimatteo.com/contact or just hit the contact is on every single page. You can send me a note, say hello, ask me any questions you'd like. You get a newsletter a few times a month. And if you have a project of your own and need work done for it, whether it's audio editing or music or voiceover or graphic design, or if you have an event and you need live music, go to nickdimatteo.com, contact me, say hello, let me know what you need. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the show. All right, we are back from the mid-roll, everybody. You know, one of these days, I'm going to be less frantic about certain aspects of this. And again, I'll say, when I split these episodes in two, it confuses me into thinking blah, blah, blah. But just, you know, last time I didn't do my usual mid-roll spiel for the part one of the 90s. And I kind of remembered, you know, so that's called improvement for those of you who are noticing that. Which brings us to 1998. We're almost to the end of the 90s here. I call 98 a predominantly lackluster year. Most albums by this point were overlong and overstuffed. It was a kind of bland year that did have a few notable highlights. Again, with some very few exceptions, the debuts were kind of bland too. Although I said that before, and then when I made my list, I was like, no, I was wrong. So we're going to see if I'm right about 98 being a bland year for debuts. When we get there, still quite a lot of dark metal. Dark metal, and I mean death metal and sludge metal, like dirge metal. Like you mention all the different subgenres of that kind of dark metal. So much of it was surging in the 90s. It's incredible how many debuts happened, much of it from Scandinavia. So I credit my wife for starting that trend. Overall, a year in which the Brights were really bright. Yeah, it's her in the background. The Brights were really bright. The bright, happy, poppy, hi, everyone's great songs, and poppy or light. And the darks were really heavy. Not much shading, which is interesting to me because we've been talking about how things started to divide in 96, 97, when you have 97 with 29 number one albums in a given year, is the most ever in history up till that point. It would be far surpassed in the digital age. And just the diversity of music, which is a wonderful thing, but the other aspects of the industry along with that were fracturing the listening experience for the world to the point where that kind of homogenous, everybody's listening to the same thing, isn't really happening anymore. I just read an article like comparing Taylor Swift to the Beatles and Beyonce and Madonna and some other people and Michael Jackson. And the stark differences really between all of them were that at the time of the artists in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and this decade here, many of them in the 90s, was again this pivot decade, partly. So many people were listening to the same, not the same stuff in terms of like nobody listened to anything else, but that the things that were popular pretty much all over. Whereas in the 90s, you had that, but then you had the beginnings of what would happen later on. You know, it's like we knew something was coming and in the 90s, and we were either embracing it, like the darkness. I was talking about the stark darkness of the music, or we were denying our fears fully and creating this bright poppy music, which also did dominate a lot in 1998. Again, there was some shaded music, of course. Everything you say in this case is a generalization, but it just struck me how 1998 was a very kind of chiaroscuro year, let's say. So top albums, you had Korn, number one album. Marilyn Manson, Alanis's album, again, number one. Hell Yes, Lauryn Hill's debut solo, number one. And Jay-Z, second album, I believe, was number one. The Beastie Boys' Hello Nasty made it to number one. Oh, it's an amazing album. Snoop and DMX and Master P all had number one albums. Dave Matthews Band, So all of those have kind of an edge to them. Korn and Marilyn Manson, Alanis and Lauryn Hill and Jay-Z and, the Beasties. But then you had Dave Matthews Band, Celine Dion. Garth Brooks had 3 different albums make it to number 1. And the City of Angels soundtrack, which was actually a really good album, soundtrack, Armageddon soundtrack, which was kind of warmed over, frankly. But all of those were very kind of like on the softer side in contrast to the harder that I mentioned at the beginning of this list, leading to the big winner for the year, the soundtrack to Titanic, ruled the year in 1998. Some debuts in 1998, Reliant K, which I didn't know at the time, again, was a Christian rock. Same thing with Jars of Clay. When they came out, I didn't immediately know they were Christian rock. And the same thing with Reliant K, which I always thought was a cool, they spell Reliant differently than you meant to. There's an E instead of an A. But there was a car called the Reliant K. They called it the K car. I want to say in the 70s or 80s. And I guess that's what they named themselves after, but I'm sure there's a Christian reference there too. I don't know. But again, Christian rock was like almost everywhere in the 90s and mostly in the late 90s. Queens of the Stone Age debut, System of a Down, and You Will Know Us by the Trail of Dead, Saves the Day, Snow Patrol, Eve 6, New Radicals with that earworm of theirs, Dropkick Murphys, Humphreys McGee. They both go together for some reason. Train, Drive-By Truckers, so transportation-based bands. Rufus Wainwright, Sean Lennon had his debut album in 98. Imogen Heap, Destiny's Child, we all knew who that is. Chocolate Genius, another neo-soul entry, debut in 98, which I found out that Chocolate Genius, the guy behind Chocolate Genius, is the father of Tessa Thompson, which is so fascinating and cool and makes me a little queasy. Anybody who lived through the 90s or is old enough to have, maybe you know why. Black Eyed Peas, Jurassic 5, Black Star, featuring Mos Def, now known as Yassine Bey, and Talib Kweli. Cannabis, Noriega, Big Pun. So some cool debuts. Again, I wouldn't call this the most amazing debut year, but some good ones. NSYNC, so there's a contradiction there. French electro band Air. Boards of Canada. So again, more electronic. Death Cab for Cutie. I've talked about them before. Bright Eyes. Didn't know debuted in 98. That's interesting to me. Some other notable releases in 98. Cher's Believe. Madonna's Ray of Light. 98 Degrees is 98 Degrees and Rising. Maxwell's Embrya. Again, Neo Soul is just going strong. Another great album by what I found in these lists is that apparently, and I wish I had known this at the time, but that gives me something to go back and listen to. A Tribe Called Quest had amazing albums throughout the entire 90s, not just the early 90s. And it was a shame that they kind of fell off the radar after a certain point. I think they're worth going back and listening to. The Coos Steal This Album. I think I have that somewhere on these shelves. Outcasts Aquamini. I mean, listen, that's too notable, and I think this is their 3rd album, and they even gotten to their huge ones that would come soon. Juvenile's 400 Degrees. Lenny Kravitz's 5, which has Fly Away, Black Velveteen, the cover of American Woman, which it's a cover to me, but that album is amazing. It's maybe my favorite Lenny Kravitz album. I don't know. Smashing Pumpkins' Adore, still going strong in the late 90s. One of the few like grunge bands to continue to put out like pretty great albums in the late 90s. Goo Goo Dolls, Dizzy Up the Girl, Sunny Day Real Estate's How It Feels to Be Something On, which is usually considered their peak. Whole Celebrity Skin, an amazing second album, frankly. It kicks. PJ Harvey's Is This Desire, Elliott Smith's XO, Beck Mutations, Neutral Milk Hotel in the Airplane Over the Sea, which anybody who mentions that band or Elephant Six mentions them. I think that was on like 500 Greatest Albums. Belle and Sebastian, Boy with the Average Strap, Lucinda Williams' Car Wheels on a Gravel Road, which is on here somewhere on these shelves. Tortoise's TNT. And a guy named Nick released an album called Listen You People in 1998, which I guess technically was my debut album. Everything I had released prior to that was an EP was an EP or a demo. So yeah, that was my debut full-length album was in 98. Nick's Listen You People. It is streaming everywhere. I did a remaster and re-release recently. 1999 is the following year of 1998, in case you were wondering. I find 99 more interesting than 98, but also a complete mess. Another big number of debuts, almost as big as that year in the middle that had like the most debuts that I've ever seen. Everything was vying and fighting and trying to stop the decade from dying. But there was no way that could be stopped. Everyone thought that something was going to end at that point because you had the Y2K and the fact that 1999 was this, supposedly end of the world year and blah, blah, blah. But really it felt a lot like a world with no direction, waiting for an apocalypse that never came, although sort of, came in some ways shortly after in the 2000s. And it was in many ways the last hurrah, as shown in that it's another year with a massive number of debuts, as I mentioned, but also a bit of looking ahead, but not without really knowing how things would change. This is nu metal's moment taking effect, although more of that would come certainly in the 2000s with bands like Linkin Park, along with still dark metal, black metal, dirge metal, whatever, just a freaking ton of it. Like, what was going on under the surface, man, in the 90s? And I love that stuff, though, some of it. And Southern hip-hop was really starting to surge by the late 90s, by 1999. Top albums in 1999, DMX, Silk the Shocker. I'm sorry, but I tend to know a lot of things. And even if I don't know a person's music, like I may have heard one or two songs from DMX, I know DMX. But who the hell is Silk the Shocker? And that's Silk with 2 Ks. You all got to tell me if you know and if you're a fan. Nas, Biggie, Foxy Brown, and Eve, the Rough Riders compilation, all #1 albums, including Limp Bizkit, Rage Against the Machine, Korn, 9 Inch Nails had a #1. They've been around for like a decade by then. Creed had a #1 album. Santana, Celine Dion, Faith Hill, The Chicks, Dixie Chicks, Garth Brooks, Tim McGraw, all #1 albums. Ricky Martin, Britney's debut album went to #1. Christina Aguilera's debut album went to #1. TLC had a #1 album. But the big winner for the year 1999, the #1 album for the entire year, was Backstreet Boys' Millennium. So you could see how there were real statements, even in the #1s, that the 90s were over. And I'm going to talk about in the conclusions how that compares to the end of the 70s. Some debuts, some real notable debuts. Method Man and Redman, Clips. I have one of Clips' albums somewhere on here, I think from the 2000s. Black Alicious, one of my favorite hip-hop bands. Mos Def, now he's known as Yasin Bey, had Black on Both Sides, an absolutely incredible album. I have it somewhere. Cisco, Ja Rule, Lil Wayne. I mean, again, amazing debut albums. Angie Stone. I did an episode on Neo Soul, and I mentioned a lot of the people I've mentioned here, including Angie Stone and Macy Gray, who both debuted in 99, and some of the other people that I mentioned in previous years in the 90s. Look it up. Soul Live, which is Soulive. It's a jazz ensemble owing, I think, something to Neo Soul, and a pretty smoky, funky band. Lou Bega, Mambo No. 5. Mandy Moore, Jessica Simpson, J-Lo, Dido, Tegan and Sarah, La Tigre, all debut albums, in 99. The Rapture, Thursday, Newfound Glory, Slipknot, Dillinger Escape Plan, Alien Ant Farm, Ted Leo and the Pharmacist, so I didn't know started in the 90s. Muse, Sun, the band I mentioned in the weird band names. Fortet, electro band. Basement Jacks, huge for me, and Kish Cash was my favorite album of theirs. Came out in the 2000s, I believe. Hank Williams III, Brad Paisley, debut albums in 99. Sufjan Stevens, My Morning Jacket, and The White Stripes debuted in 1999. Some other notable 99 albums. Moby's Play, which was just a phenomenon at the time. It was one of those where you kind of loved it when it came out and were kind of sick of it when it left. Beck's Midnight Vultures. Red Hot Chili Peppers' Californication. Flaming Lips, The Soft Bulletin. Not my favorite of theirs, but getting close. That would be Yoshimi, Battles of Pink Robots, which we'll get to in the next episode of What is an Album and Why. Olivia Tremor Controls Black Foliage. The Magnetic Field 69 Love Songs. Sigur Rós Ægis Björn. If you know how to pronounce Icelandic, let me know. Opeth's Swedish metal version of Swedish metal had a great notable album. Dream Theater, progressive rock. Alison Krauss, Built to Spill, Keep It Like a Secret. Destiny's Child, The Writings on the Wall. Mary J. Blige, Mary. Dr. Dre, 2001. Roots, Things Fall Apart, which is usually considered their peak, although they had some amazing albums after that. MF Doom's Operation Doomsday, and Eminem's The Slim Shady LP. So I think a much more interesting and impactful year than 98 in many ways. It was like it was starting to shake off the doldrums of that certain kind of, laconic, laissez-faire 90s feeling and moving into the future. And we're going to talk about that in the conclusions right now. Again, a seriously fractured second half of the decade, but overall, the decade incredibly vibrant, full of lots of change and progress, changing of the guard, truly the last of the old world and the first of the new world, not perfect by any stretch, but progress is progress. As reminiscent of how music was made and consumed in the past as it was prescient about how it would be in the future. I mean, a real freaking pivot decade. It's been said that the 1970s was the heyday of the album, and most lists that have the best albums ever have more from that decade than any other. In fact, in the two most recent Rolling Stone 500 greatest albums of all time from 2020 and 2023, which I haven't seen the 2023 one yet, the 1970s wins by a wide margin, the most it has on every single list that's been compiled in the last, 20 years as far as greatest albums of all time. At first, the 1960s was right behind the 70s in those first few lists. And then the 90s surged. And then the last two lists from 2020 and 2023 shows an extremely strong second to the 1970s of most of the greatest albums on the list. And no other decade, not the 80s or 60s or anything, comes anywhere near, certainly the 70s, but not even anywhere near the 90s as far as great albums. And then, look, it's clear great albums have come out in the last 25 years and will continue to. That's very clear. And if you're not listening to contemporary music, give it a try. But the 1990s is really, for some certain reasons, the last true heyday of the album. It was the last time that, not the last time ever, but the last time people bought albums, to that degree. Again, 1999 was the peak for album sales in the history of the world. So another way the 90s is like the 70s. And again, the reason the 80s seemed to start so quickly, that I talked about when we talked about the 80s, that rapid changeover, is because, and I didn't say this then because I was having fun, but the more I think about it, also, the aesthetic of the 80s honestly started a couple years, at the last tail end of the 70s, like 78, 79. You start to hear things that are happening that already sound like the 80s. There are songs that I play with the 80s cover band that actually came out in 79. And the same is true for the 2000s. From the 90s to the 2000s, you could see and hear things shifting forward in 1998 and 99 into the 2000s. So, that changeover, I think, is the second most rapid changeover musically of any decade. Again, the 70s to the 80s, to me, I think was the quickest. But as I talked about when I mentioned 98 and even a little bit in 97, how people were kind of getting tired of the decade, like these things can happen. They didn't in 1958 or 68 or 88 or even 2008. From those years into the next decade was not this rapid changeover. In some ways, it was a retreat. In other ways, it was just kind of a slow morphing into the next decade. But from the 70s to the 80s and from the 90s to the 2000s, those two changeovers started before they started, if you know what I mean. Like in both cases, the decade was getting tired of itself. If you know anything about the 70s, you know why. They were getting tired of the bleakness or the complacency of the ennui and needed a refresher, something to brighten it up. And if you're transcribing this, for those of you monks who write by hand, yes, that's the second time I've used the word ennui. Now it's the third time. But side note, since I have some time, I'm going to make a side note, and I promised I would do this, on the death of grunge. If it died, and I contend things never really die, they just morph. People do die, though, actually. I have also heard that death is dumb. It morphed and fractured more than it died. But if it died, if we want to say grunge died, fine. There would be 3 reasons. 1, saturation due to weaker copies of grunge. And if you're a fan of Creed or Nickelback, more power to you. I actually have a lot of respect, at least for Nickelback, because you would be amazed at how successful they were in the 2000s. Or maybe you wouldn't. But they deserve respect for that, and they seem, from what I've heard, to be pretty cool guys. But it was like grunge, echo of grunge. It was grunge light. It was pop grunge, whatever. Number 2, changing tastes. It just happens. Okay? And the most important to me is for the reason why grunge died so quickly is that the actual people died. I mean, when you have Cobain dying, and then, Shannon Hoon, and then you had Lane Staley, and then of course years later you have Chris Cornell and Scott Weiland, like they're just all just dropping off, and that's just the well-known people. There was somebody from Smashing Pumpkins who died. Like had more of them survived longer, you wonder if we would have seen a different evolution of music or not. Whatever. It was the 90s. When things are easy to get and consume, this is my next point in the conclusion, they're usually less respected, and people spend less time and consideration on them. I had to talk about this with Steve Erickson, who's frequently on this show, about how much harder it is for people to absorb an album the way it needs to be, because very few people listen to something more than once unless they're obsessed with it, and then that's the only thing they listen to more than once, right? But that's one reason why the 90s is still looked on with some strong album nostalgia, because it really is the last major period in which albums were consumed in that way. There was an echo of that in the 2000s, don't get me wrong, but by the mid-2000s, downloading had taken over, and then eventually streaming would take over, so it was dying already. That's why the peak was 99. As things are often cyclical, though, and I always say they are, that's why rock and roll has never really died, and other types of music. It makes me curious to see when the next album heyday will be, because it'll come eventually. I don't know when or how, but it'll come. Note on album lengths. The average length of an album was largely dictated by format, as the length of a single has been, and the length of a single has held steady in between like 2.5 minutes to 4.5 minutes for like 100 years or more. But it started that way because the first way that a single was made, or whether it was on acetate or whatever, you couldn't put more than 3 minutes, and then eventually more than 4 or 4-ish or whatever it was. You could squeeze a little more on as they... I squeezed a little more on the other week. He was really pissing me off. Anyway, on the single, but really the average was that. Now, as for an album, there was the same reason. You can only fit so much on vinyl. So it was hovering around 40 minutes for decades and decades, even with the advent of cassettes. When the CD came along, that slowly started to change. The limitation went up to 75, 80 minutes. Now, that doesn't mean all albums did, but that's how much you could put on one CD, which clearly affected album length, because artists were like, and industry people were like, let's put more on, The 90s in particular saw a lot of albums go over an hour. I remember that. And I remember thinking, yeah, I love this artist, but geez, And then the average length of an album, which was hovering around 40 minutes, creeped up and up and up until in 2000, it was the first time it ever exceeded 50 minutes for the average length of an album. Now, the length rose considerably more when streaming started. So, another 10 years after that, it was even up, it might have been like 60 or whatever. And I'll explain why. I don't know the exact answer in a second. It reached a peak, maybe, as far as average album length, about a decade ago. But, interesting point. You can make an album as long as you want now, more or less. But the average album length has actually dropped over the last 10 years. Today's albums are actually 4% shorter than the average length of an album in 1998, which is kind of cool because you explore something. It's like when prog rock went all crazy and went too far, and then it pulled back and morphed into something else. Same with album lengths. You go as far as you can go and see what works, and then you're like, nah, you know what? It's probably better to keep it under 50 minutes, which is what it was in 1998. And so now the average album length is about 45 minutes, which is still a little bit longer than what it was in history, but not by much. It's an average that people like to consume. Now, I'm going to say this. This is a general point, not just for this episode. I could be missing things. I do not have all of the time in a given week to research for days and days. I do research for hours and write. But days and days would take a team. I wish I had a team. That's partly why I want to continue to fundraise, because I would like season 7 to include a team. And some of that team should be researchers, because I couldn't find data on a lot of stuff I wanted to talk about, such as the longest single album, not double album or beyond. A detailed chart of average album lengths per year. Some of that information I got, but there wasn't much detail. A chart of the number of albums released per year. I mentioned some of that in the first episode of the 1990s, but I couldn't find hard numbers on every single year. That should be an easy thing to do, at least since 1973, when things were really starting to be counted. Chart of the number of debut albums per year was hard to find. I didn't find it. Chart of number of albums to reach number 1 in a given year I couldn't find. Like we talked about sometime like 2012 or 2020, I think it is, had the most number 1 albums in a given year with 43 or something like that. In 1990, when was it? Did I say 7, 8, 9? 98 had 29 number 1 albums, whatever. But it should be easier to find that information. And again, patreon.com/music is not a genre. If you join, the more of you join, the more of a team I can compile, and I can do that research. That said, if you know it, then let me know. I want to know if you know any of those answers, right? Stats are fun, which leads to the bonus MXtra video on patreon.com/music is not a genre. For this episode is a stats heavy bonus, which is the top 10 year-end singles from 1988 to 2002. So all of the 90s and straddling a little bit, to show how we think of rock as being dominant in the 1990s. And I mentioned this in the other episode. But not for singles. In fact, I'm not gonna spoil it. Check out the bonus episode, patreon.com/music is not a genre, and find out the curve that you will see or hear when I talk about top 10 singles from 88, 89, 90, 91, all the way up to 2002. It's pretty freaking interesting. And it'll kind of wet your whistle for albums of the 2000s, which will be coming in a few weeks. Featured song for this week. Again, I have already, shared a bunch of my harder songs and grunge influenced songs and all of that. And one of my rules is if I have a song I can share that's relevant to the episode that I haven't shared before, I'm going to do that. And I haven't broken that rule yet. And I think I'm up to 80 some songs or something like that, with quite a few more to go. And I'm going to keep that up. But so there's a certain kind of post-grunge, kind of gin blossomy, like alt-rock, indie rock sound that I was really into in the late 90s and early 2000s that had an ambience to it. I always like ambient elements in my music. Just weird enough to be alternative, but still has a poppy tinge to it. It's kind of a version of power pop. And one of the songs, the featured song for this episode, is a song from Listen You People, which came out in 1998, so it is relevant, and it's called Peggy's Eyes. That's the name of my ex-wife, and it's one of the few cuts from that album that actually kind of captured some of the sound that I would bring forward when I formed the band Wreck. And it's something that I hope you stick around and listen to in just a minute or two. Questions for you. What are your favorite albums from the second half of the 90s? Do you feel this was a strong time for albums in general? Do you prefer the early 90s? Do you not like the 90s for albums at all? Can you see how albums and music culture in general was changing and dissembling rapidly towards the end of the decade to the point where it would fracture completely by the 2000s? I want to know your answers to all these things because, as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for this two-part episode on 1990s albums, and I will talk to you next week. Up and down. I've got to save myself for when she comes around.